You might hear my almost 2-year-old come and bang at the door every now and then.
Yeah, no, we know how that is. Okay, well, I think we're gonna go and get started. Thank y'all for coming so much. Thank y'all for coming today. Today, we're privileged to have Dr. Aimee Barber. She's a faculty member in the College of Education at UL Lafayette, as all of you know, but I'll do the intro anyway. She received her bachelor and master's degrees in education and gifted education from UL Lafayette and her doctorate from the University of Florida. Dr. Barber is also leading the development of UL's very innovative laboratory school called the Learning Lab. Over the years, I know I've learned so much from Dr. Barber because she brings to every project her own experiences as a classroom teacher, her passion for innovation, and a desire to improve education for all children. So let's welcome Dr. Barber as she shares with us the Writers Workshop model. And just a reminder that as we go through this, feel free to pop in your questions in the chat window so we can address those as we're kind of going through the presentation. So welcome, Dr. Barber. Thank you so much for joining us, as you do every time, and we know you.
Well, thank you. That was very nice. Too kind. Yeah, I will share my screen just while I'm doing that, just so you know what I'm thinking about this presentation is really coming at it from this idea of maker-centered learning, kind of connecting that over to the language arts fields. Something that we've noticed through just some asking teachers lots of questions over the years is that the largest number of minutes in a day in the school day is dedicated to language arts. It's normally about 90 minutes. And so if you think about how many minutes a day are dedicated to maker-centered learning, right now we could probably guess that it's 0. So we have to find ways to bring it into other content areas, especially things like language arts where there's more time. So that's kind of where this topic came about, thinking about how does maker-centered learning fit into the context of other subjects. And so today I'm going to talk to you about Writers Workshop. As a first grade teacher, I use this almost every day. So, some days you just get busy with other things and it doesn't happen. So it's no big deal if it doesn't become an everyday part of your routine, but if you can figure out a way to sort of work it in, as maybe you start off with every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we do Writers Workshop, or maybe you make it a Tuesday, Thursday thing. And even if you only have about a 30-minute chunk of time, you can make it work. Okay, so we'll go through just an overview of what we'll look at today. So I want to talk about just the workshop model versus a traditional approach. So even just the word workshop, you can just kind of hear that it has a different tone to it than maybe what we traditionally think about as writing. So we might think about rewriting sentences or finding the misspelling and then rewriting the sentence again. I know my own kids hate doing that. It just takes a lot of time and it doesn't really have a purpose. So when we think about a workshop, we think of more like a bustling kind of idea factory of learners doing stuff. And then the second thing is, and this goes with any subject, teaching with the skills of practicing professionals in mind. So, if we're teaching a science topic, we should probably talk about, how do you think scientists would investigate this question? And that's really the skills that we want the kids to develop. It's not just the content knowledge, but also the skills of practicing professionals. So in the same regard, we'll look at, what do our favorite authors do and how can we mirror that in our own writing to make books and plays and scripts, as engaging as possible. We'll look at the structure of Writers Workshop in terms of minutes. So what does this look like in your classroom? How do you have to dedicate a number of minutes? How do you keep yourself on track? And then one of the big ones is, what kind of routines do you need for your kids to master before you can just release them to go and make books by themselves? What do you have to kind of put in place first? Then the steps of the writing process, which I'm sure you all remember, it starts with brainstorming. There's some sort of rough draft in there. I'm sure you've all done that before. A lot of us have bad memories of the writing process because we may have been forced to write about certain topics. So we'll re-examine that writing process and see how it can be more effective and engaging. And then this idea of how to help students be able to self-pace, because, if we think about long-term solutions that we might have for kids, it would be, for me, them being able to go out and do these things on their own. So how can we help them to learn to pace themselves, to evaluate their own work, to request the evaluation of peers, and not look at that as something negative or something that tells them that they're not good at something, but really we want to get the feedback of peers, and we want to evaluate our work ourselves so that we can improve. And then finally, Writer's Workshop is an awesome way to differentiate and personalize learning, as well as any workshop model style. Okay, so that's this little rundown. So just first of all, did you know that there are 6 language arts? And if you know them, can you just say some of them? There are actually 6.
Is writing one of them?
Yes, writing is one. Speaking is another one. Yes. Reading is another one. Yes. So reading, writing, speaking. Yes. Viewing is in there. There's listening, viewing, and then there's one final one. Does anyone know? So it's actually visually representing. Oh yeah, there you go, Erin. Erin got it. Great. So reading, writing, and I put them in these colors because you can see that they kind of go together. So whenever, we can read what we write, we can write what we then read, speaking and listening, viewing and visually representing. If we think about a traditional approach to a language arts classroom, it kind of lives in that reading and writing area and doesn't often expand into speaking and listening, talking to kids how to listen to a presentation, how to nod to let the speaker know that you're hearing them, how to ask good questions. And then ultimately, how can they visually represent something, whether that's through a video, a presentation, a poster, something, and then be able to also turn around and view someone else's and give feedback. So these are those 6 language arts. And so whenever we look at this model, I want you to think about which of those 6 are being covered in a writer's workshop approach. So when we think about traditional versus the workshop model, I just looked online and found an example of a worksheet that kind of makes me think about a traditional language arts classroom. So this one's about joining sentences. So there's this, jumbled up story about the game of chess. And then the kids are tasked with going into that story and then putting the sentences in the right order. So I don't know about you, but this just right off the bat just feels like busy work to me. Like I don't really want to sit there and read this story about chess. Maybe I'm not really into chess, first of all. Then maybe if I'm not a very good reader, is that any indication of my ability to come up with a creative story? So where there might be place for these types of things in language arts classrooms, if we look to the other side of the screen, when we think about a workshop model, we're really more thinking about creating writings of their own. So the kids are actually engaged in the act of writing and they come up with products that they can share. So it's more about writing with a purpose. Maybe whenever you're learning about letter writing, why does it have to fall into a workshop format? In a worksheet format? Why can't kids write real letters to their grandparents or to their favorite authors? So we're just really trying to flip the idea of we're not just doing work to get work done and to show that we met a standard, but we're taking that standard and we're attaching a purpose to it. Okay, so whenever I would do this, you might just start with who needs to know how to write. So we would just have kids brainstorm, maybe the kids could say, I need to learn how to write because I want to write a letter to my friend or I want to have a pen pal. But who else needs to know how to write? What kinds of professionals do you think need to know how to write? Yes, teachers need to know how to write, yeah. Yeah, so a lot. Scientists, engineers, doctors, scribes. Yes, absolutely. So what I suggest doing whenever you're having this discussion, just put all of these ideas on a whiteboard somewhere where throughout the day, throughout the month, however long you have it up, even just on a poster that you can revisit, you might go in and add different things to that list so that they ultimately are going to be able to see that almost any career choice needs to have some level of writing. And so then it kind of trains our brains to think of writing as a skill that we want to have, that we want to improve upon, and not just something that, my teacher is giving me work to do, and I'm going to do it because she said so. So some of the ones that I think are interesting is obviously authors. I use this book as an example. I don't remember if it's Diary of a Wimpy Kid or I think it's the Captain Underpants author said that his second grade teacher used to send him in the hallway, like he was getting in trouble all the time. And that's where he came up with the Captain Underpants series. So I just think that's such an interesting story that he came up with that and is now, I don't know, maybe a millionaire, from his work because of something he did in the hallway after getting kicked out of his second grade class. But what if his second grade teacher had more of this workshop approach where, she could now be on the cover as like, the teacher who started it all that let me create Captain Underpants in my classroom. So it's interesting because we can think about how to put that work in the classroom. But also, if you're doing read alouds with your class, like for us, Robert Munsch became one of my first graders' favorite authors. And so I would just try to get my hands on as many Robert Munsch books as I could. By the way, you can check out as many as 50 books from the public library, and I think they can be checked out for up to 9 weeks at a time. So you don't have to buy all these books. But eventually you'll be kind of turned on to certain authors, and you want to use that, you want to use that to kind of initiate conversations about why do we like reading Robert Munsch books? Well, because he's funny and he's engaging, and it's fun to laugh whenever we read a story. And so then what can we take from that author who's our favorite and then apply to our own work? So authors, obviously, I used Woody in here because something else that's pretty interesting is that, people who write movies or direct movies have to be writers. And so when we talk about using the skills of practicing professionals, what I'm proposing is that you actually use the skills that Pixar uses to create storyboards for their movies. Use that as your organization for Writer's Workshop. And then finally, people who write recipes. So chefs, or if you're writing a recipe book, you might need to write. So this would just be, kind of you're doing it on your own, you're doing a brainstorm. So what happens when we use the skills of practicing professionals? It kind of helps us as teachers to go in and explore. So if somebody said, threw out a scribe at a doctor's office, well, then that might be a good opportunity for you to go and find maybe a video or, an explanation of what that career is, what that person does. So you can bring in some of that work, oh, here's a professional that uses writing in this way. One example that I wanted to share with you is that these are two examples of third grade language arts standards, and they're both having to do with characters and a story. So a lot of times you'll see these standards being taught through something similar to that worksheet that I showed you. So read this simple story and then tell about these characters, or use dialogue, between character A and character B that are given to you, to do the things in the second standard. But what if we looked to something exciting and engaging, like Disney movies, like things that kids might be more interested in? And so I just wanted to show you this brief clip about what they found for kind of rules that apply to every Pixar character.
All well-drawn characters have a spine. And the idea is that the character has an inner motor, a dominant, unconscious goal that they're striving for, an itch that they can't scratch. Wally's was to find the beauty. Marlin's, the father in Finding Nemo, was to prevent harm. And Woody's was to do what was best for his child.
Okay, so I just wanted to show you that because depending on what grade level you're teaching, you might stop and focus on one piece of that. So maybe at the end you pause and talk about how this character, fails the want and fails the need. Obviously, this would depend on them having seen the movies before. So you might want to give a little synopsis of one if you're highlighting a certain character. But what it does is it just kind of takes the learning and the activity that you're asking the kids to do, and it gives it some bigger purpose. It goes outside of the classroom and it connects to something that they don't normally associate with in-class learning like they might with things like worksheets. So it just kind of takes it and expands it outward. So imagine now if we use something like what they're talking about in how to enrich our characters. Maybe we only are focusing on, how do we give our main character a spine? What does that mean? And so we just brainstorm that, and then we might use that as our mini lesson in order to, help kids whenever they're going and writing independently to strengthen their story. So we're kind of using the tools of professionals to then take back to our own work. Okay, so basically what's happening during a writer's workshop is that students are writing. They're actively engaged in the work. So they're working on things that are meaningful to them. They're choosing their own topics. They have some choice in how they're going to publish their work, and they're self-paced. So they can work at their own pace. They're not worried about being the first one to turn it in. This does take some practice, and I'll give you some tips for that. But really, ultimately, if somebody walked into your classroom, it should just feel like it's alive with writers. The teachers, at the same time, whenever we can get our kids writing efficiently by themselves, then that frees you up to go and just sit next to kids and give them that just-in-time support that they individually need. So, if you can imagine, maybe you might envision a teacher teaching writing at the front of the room, delivering a whole group lesson to the whole classroom. Well, but what if, the student over here is ready to write chapter books and is like, just so ready to dive into it. And the student over here is still trying to sound out very basic words. Your whole group instruction is not really reaching either of them, probably. So whenever we can equip kids with what they need to start writing on their own, then that kind of frees you up to go and do these individual conferences. You can also have a conferencing table where you're pulling small groups of kids to the side. And in those conferences, you can start to figure out what individual kids need. And I'll show you some ways to keep track of their goals, but also make decisions for upcoming mini lessons. So instead of delivering a whole group lesson for your full 30 minutes or 60-minute writing block, you might only deliver a mini lesson for about 10. Okay, so here's that structure in minutes. This is a very simple way to think about it. And the minutes are different depending on the amount of time that you have for writing. But basically, you're looking at about a fourth of your time, or 10 to 15 minutes for a mini lesson. So this would be a time whenever you might read aloud a favorite author, where you use that to kind of talk about whatever standard you're teaching or whatever skill that author does really well. You want to keep these lessons focused on the skills of great writers. So connect back to, the practicing professionals. We never want these lessons to feel like they only live in our classrooms and not outside of our classrooms in the real world, just like anything else. And then we want to use that as a chance to talk about what great authors do, and also to maybe you really want to make sure that you're connecting to whatever standards are being covered that week in your let's say the guidebooks or CKLA, whatever curriculum your school has adopted, you can align your mini lessons to the standards of that day or that week. And then the chunk of the time, the biggest bulk of the time is really spent with writers writing and with you doing those individual or small group conferences where we're really looking at targeting specific learning needs and personalizing your feedback to kids. And then the final amount of time, that share time, what's nice about this is that kids will finish their writings at different times. So some days you might have one or two who are ready to share their stories. And so this is, if you've heard of an author's chair, you don't have to have an author's chair, actually like your teacher's chair. If you have, I highly recommend everyone has like a common carpet area where everyone can gather and sit on the floor. Even if you're teaching 5th grade, I still really think it's useful. But some place where kids can get together and not be so removed all at their desk while the author is presenting in the front. So then that student might share the work that they've created. If no one's finished with their work yet, you might just give a bit of time for kids to turn and tell a partner next to them what they worked on today and what their plan is for their writing tomorrow. So it's just a 5-minute share. That might be a time for you to kind of wrap up and reconnect to the skill of that day. But it's a dedicated time to make sure that we're not just rushing to the end and putting it all away and rushing off to lunch. So whenever we think about this, and this, you can go back and look at this later, but it's just some tips. I'll just kind of talk through these. But if you're thinking about starting here, you might imagine that kids are coming in from recess, they're sweating and they go put their stuff down, and then they know to just go and meet you at the carpet. That's just an understanding. So that would be a routine to build in. So when we come in from, first recess, we're going to go and we always meet on the carpet. We always share some sort of read aloud, some sort of mini lesson. And then whenever that switch occurs, you might want to have some sort of signal, whether it's a bell, maybe it's a clap that you do, some sort of a signal to indicate that it's time to start writing. One suggestion I have is to maybe have a certain type of like soft music or something. I had this awesome CD called Music for Focus, and just something to play in the background that's an indicator that that right now it's writing time, and that you'll hear from the teacher through like conferences and things. But for the most part, we're going to try to just keep writing. We're going to try to stay on task. One thing to remember here too is that we don't want to try to jump into this right away. So your first week of school, you're not going to be doing writer's workshop. You might be setting up the routines and establishing the procedures. So what do we do when the bell rings? What do we do when this music is on? What is a conference? Where do we meet after recess? Stuff like that, just to make sure that whenever you do start, which might be like 3 or 4 weeks into the school year, that you have all of those like mechanics figured out so that it can really work smoothly. And then finally, they're just working at their own pace, like I mentioned. So this will be that chance to either share their completed work or for them to just share where they are. So here are just some tips. If you look to the side, you may have seen these in some of the classrooms that you've observed, but this is kind of what I would recommend having up on the wall somewhere. Each of these, what do you call these? Clothespins have a student's name on them. So this is what allows them to self-pace. So whenever they come in from recess and you do your mini lesson, you don't have to start over again and say, okay, you're on drafting, you're on revising, and you're also not restricting the student who is ready to write their novel, from waiting around until the whole class has finished with their rough drafts. There's no waiting here, because remember, at this point, you've practiced all of these. They know what it is. You've modeled them. You've given examples. And so now they're able to just work, because, if I come in from recess on Wednesday and I see my name up on edit, then I know exactly where I am, and it doesn't take me long to get back on track. So that's, one tip, is to have something hanging up on the wall. The other thing, like I mentioned, is not to start too soon, to make sure you teach and model and practice all of those little routines first. Something else is for you to have a writer's workshop binder. This will just help you keep track of, like, let's say you want to keep a goal of conferencing with every student 3 times during every 9 weeks. It doesn't have to be something where you're getting with every student once a week. If you want to do that, you might want to do small groups or something, but it could be that you have a goal of every other week. You're going to really sit down and focus some instruction for every child. So some sort of binder will help you to keep track of that. And I'll give you at the end a little resource that I made for you. The music tip, here's the steps and the student name clips. Keeping some sort of bell or chime near your conferencing table in case the noise level gets too loud. You know, you want to try to make this as much of an independent student activity as possible so that you can give that real personalized attention to the kids you're working with. And then anything that you're using, like one thing is having some revision checklists that I'll show you. We might want to keep that in one spot. So wherever you have your display, maybe a little table underneath that has a basket of revision checklists or items that are needed to make books eventually. You know, everything is sort of in that one spot to really give the kids the autonomy to be able to go and do it themselves. And then also having that folder for them. For me, I had seat sacks behind each chair. You know, they could put in their seat sack and then they just pulled it right out. They knew where they were and they could get started. Those are just some tips. So speaking of those tips, if you, let's see, I forgot to copy it. If we can, hold on just a second. I'm going to copy this share link into the chat so that you can follow along with this with me. Are there any questions so far?
I think it's such a great example of making, you know, connecting into the Maker Center learning stuff. I wonder about those things like co-inspiration and co-critique. Clearly the critique is in there, but how do you see co-inspiration playing out within this framework?
Yeah, well, actually in this beginning part, this brainstorming and organizing, it's really, you know, the sky's the limit. And so you're not restricting any sort of topics, whereas the story before was about reorganizing a story about chess. So within all of this, there's so much room for, you know, talking to kids near you. And that's why I recommended having that bell near your conference table. Like, you know, I think that a high functioning classroom has a kind of like buzz to it. And so we don't want to say that it has to be silent because we want kids to constantly kind of co-construct ideas. And you'll see in the revising stage that they are working together for revisions. So I think it's really the opportunities are throughout. Okay, so this is that writing process that I mentioned that you have all seen before. Does anyone have like horrible memories of this or anyone love this? Normally we have a few of both sides. But oftentimes whenever we have bad memories attached to it, it's because we were kind of told what to do. We were restricted on how quickly we could move through it, or maybe we were rushed through it. So a lot of times, you know, those are the contributors of why we didn't like it. It wasn't necessarily the process itself. So we're just taking a new approach to this with the workshop model. So in that document that I just shared, you'll see that the first page takes you to something that looks like this. Just the brainstorming stage. But instead of just brainstorming with nothing, we can give some context. So this would change. Let's say you want kids to write a nonfiction story. Maybe you might have them choose a favorite animal or an ecosystem. You know, they're choosing a topic still, but you're kind of structuring the content around a certain topic that you want to cover. In this case, we're just writing a narrative. We're just writing a story. And so one of the starters that I really like to start with is once there was a, and an example is once there was a cowboy doll who came to life, which is sort of a reference, is a reference to the Toy Story movies. It just started with an idea. Once there was a cowboy doll who came to life. So what I recommend is having kids just spend some time brainstorming possible ways to finish that once there was a sentence. And by giving a couple of examples, they won't just put once there was a cat, but we want to say like once there was a cat who something. So we want to kind of keep going. So we want to encourage them to have maybe 5 to 7 different brainstorming ideas. This would be a great opportunity to kind of like talk to a neighbor about something that they have. You know, we're going to try not to use the same ideas, but maybe you might find some inspiration from a neighbor. So we want to encourage that collaboration at every stage. So then we look to writers brainstorm, but then how do they get organized? And I think that this is missing in a lot of writers' process steps. They just jump straight from brainstorming into drafting. And so you'll notice in the one that I put up here that it has brainstorming and organizing as either one step together or even separate steps. So we look to the professionals at how they get organized. And one way that they do this is through storyboarding. So going back to those Disney Pixar films, this is what actually happens, for the real writers of these multi-million-dollar movies that are world known. So this is an example of a short that was written so that, those little short movies that sometimes play at the beginning of films at the movie theater. This is for one of those. So what I want to point out to you is that this very first one starts with, once upon a time, there were some squabbly birds on a wire. So if we look back at our brainstorm, once there was this story started with, once there were some squabbly birds on a wire. And then from there, as we start to organize our thoughts about this brainstormed idea, you'll see it turn into this. So this is the way that the Pixar storyboard artists organize their thoughts. And it turns out to be a really great way for kids to organize their thoughts after they've done some brainstorming. So I've included this in that link that I gave you. It just starts with once there was a, and so if you put, a favorite movie in your head right now and think about the beginning of that movie where it just starts off with, presenting. Once there was a, it just presents a story. It could be a person, it can be an object, but it's presented in that way. Then the second part, every day, kind of gives us a glimpse into the everyday life of that person or object until one day, number 3, something happens. So some turn of events happen. Because of that, something happens, and we put ×3 right here because oftentimes because of that, something happens, and because of that, something happens. Until finally, until finally is kind of the climax of the movie, and then ever since then just kind of brings us down until the movie finally ends. But if we go back to this slide, you'll see once upon a time there were some, every day, until one day, then because of that, because of that, because of that, until finally, and then ever since that day. So you can show kids that it really is the actual, storyboard setup that the Pixar movies use. So whenever we do this, it just helps a lot. I mean, a lot of kids are like, wow, they really feel like they're doing something meaningful, whereas before they were just doing worksheets. So this is, how we've been doing some at-home school stuff lately. This is what my second grader is working on right now. So he's in second grade. He's still 7, not quite 8 yet. So here's his once there was a ideas. And then we added to the bottom, and you could do this later on, or maybe you wouldn't ever do this with first graders, but who's your protagonist? So who's your hero or main character of the story? And then is there an antagonist? So someone who's trying to prevent that person or thing from completing a goal. And so here he is filling in his organizer. And so what I like about this organizer is that you can see that here he's pretty much put out his rough draft. So whenever we go to create the draft, it's going to be a more complete version, whereas if we just jumped straight from brainstorming, then it wouldn't be as complete. There's his stuff. He's still working on it. Okay, so then that kind of brings us to this idea of what is happening. So while the kids are writing, what is this idea of the teachers doing conferences? What does that mean? So I just wanted to show you a brief clip of this teacher doing a writing conference with a first grader. And notice on this, off to the sides, I put these elements of differentiation. So I'm sure you've heard this in some of your courses already, that we can differentiate the content. So that would mean that if we're working with different kids, depending on their skill level, we might be still reminding some kids to put capital letters and periods, while other kids are working on like commas in a series, or how to add adverbs to make your story more interesting. So that would be differentiating content. And then process, how we come to that content. And then product, we might have them choose what kind of stories they want to create. And on the other side, what can we differentiate there, or what do we base our differentiation on? It can be on their academic readiness, their interest, or their learning style. Okay, so here's a little clip of this guy in his conference.
So I'm gonna actually go back to the store and I'm gonna actually sound out all the words so it can make it be right so they don't get confused.
So can I ask you, so as a writer, you're using our spelling strategies?
Yes.
I love it. I love it.
So now I now need to do, I thought old. Oh, I can only do this. This is one. So I'm gonna add one line. So I need to think in my brain how I will spell it.
So I liked how you're using some of the strategies that we've worked on before for your spelling.
Oh yeah. So I'll make use the older I-E-I-O-U so I can do old.
And I think you were just saying when you made the line, I think this is the strategy where you were trying to do. You were clapping out parts and you were drawing your line and trying to make the sounds. Can I give you another new strategy for today?
What is it?
Okay. Sometimes when you are trying to spell a tricky word, one of the strategies you can do is you can think of other words you know and use those words to help you. So your word is old. I want to try to think of some other words that maybe sound like old or rhyme with old. And if I can figure out how to spell those words, they're going to help you spell old. So the strategy is going to be to use a word you already know. So let me write that out. Use a word you already know. So this will be another strategy for spelling. Okay? So you use a word you already know. So for example, I know how to spell the word cold. 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 I spell cold like this. C-O-L-D. And cold is going to help me spell another word. It's going to help me spell the word cold. How do you think I spell cold? If I know how to spell cold, how do we spell cold?
So to remove the C and add an H and add the old to right here. And I actually saw something in cold.
What did you, let's write down cold. So you said change the C to an H and then add the O-L-D. Okay, so what did you see?
So I thought in cold and cold, I know now I can discover old. If I remove the C and H, I can actually be old.
Oh, will you write it down here? Because this is your strategy. You can use.
Okay, so I like that example because you can see his little light bulb moment. You know, it's something so simple, but also because you can see how personalized and targeted the conferences are. So, you know, she's specifically addressing his need to spell the word old. I mean, it's that specific and tailored. And so from there, she was able to talk about new strategies, and you can tell that she's actually doing more of a reading lesson than she is even about writing. But it's because of that individual time that they had reserved that she was able to do something so targeted to just him. Okay, so from there, we're thinking about what's happening during this process. So we know that kids are writing right now, the teachers are doing some conferencing, but then what happens whenever they get to this revise and edit stage? We can treat this more formally, which in the past I think is the reason why people are often turned away from the writing process is because of such an amount of time spent on editing and revising. This kind of lets the kids look at their own work first. So I just did a little sample revise and edit checklist. So notice, first of all, that they are saying they're checking off either yep or not yet, which should remind you of the Carol Dweck growth mindset. You know, we're not saying no, we're not putting an X, we're not putting red pen all over their papers. Someone told me just to throw all of my red pens away as a teacher, and so I just put them in the art center and just used like purple or blue instead because red is just so abrasive. But in here, we're just saying, yes, I got it. I started my writing with a hook. I stayed on topic, or I'm saying I'm giving myself a not yet because I know that I have a chance to go back and work on that. And then at the end, it's a chance for us to get some feedback from our partner, where a partner is looking at our story, we're reading it aloud to them, then they're reading our story, and then they're giving us some suggestions to make it stronger. So these are those things that you might have sitting on the table where your writer's workshop display is. What I recommend for this is as you have kids put their clip on edit or revise, then they would come and get one of these and also look on the chart to see who else's clip is on that edit and revise, and that's how they would locate their partner. So even that part can be done without you. All right, so then we want to think about publishing, which is my favorite part. The easiest way to think of is to think about just making a book. These can be as simple as this is just like 2 pieces of computer paper and a piece of construction paper just stacked up and then folded in half. You staple it and you have a book. So that can be how you start off with your book making. I mean, it's so simple. Another one of the paper that I used in 1st grade looks like this. So it comes like large like this, and I found it on Amazon if you're interested. I don't know if you can see, but it has lines at the bottom. Can you see that? So the bottom part is lined and the top part is blank. And so they write at the bottom, and then there's a whole top section to be able to do the illustrations up here. So for this, it's just these large pieces of paper that are half lined and half left for illustrations, and then these large pieces of construction paper. And then I actually got one of those like book staplers that has the really long arm to be able to staple these with some Scholastic bonus points. So definitely sign up for Scholastic when you're here. But anyway, when you're starting to think about publishing options, remember that to differentiate, you want to offer some choice based on their interest and what they want to create. But to start off, I would recommend that you just have everyone create a book for their first round through Writer's Workshop. It's really helpful for you to have one created. So maybe the first time that you do this, you're sort of, maybe that afternoon, you're working on your own book so that you can eventually have a good example. You can have all of your materials housed in that Writer's Workshop section so that there's no questions, it's all there and the kids know what to do. And then they would share their work in an author's chair. One thing that I really liked, I had a very small, almost like mini book display where when they were finished with those books, they would put them on the bookshelf along with the rest of the books. And just like kids were checking out books from the bookshelf, the regular bookshelf, they were also able to check out the books of classmates. So, I mean, it was so exciting for kids when they saw their friend or their classmate, go in and put their little stick marking where they got their book and take the book that the student had written themselves to read at their desk. So we treated them like real books that really belonged in our little library. So those are really fun ways to publish, and you might just leave it at that. Even if you left it at that, this is still an example of them creating something, they're making. Or we can take it a step further. You might want to, maybe after everyone goes through one cycle, you're going to add one additional publishing option and display that in your Writer's Workshop area of your classroom. So you might add an option. They can still make a book, but they can also write a script for a play. So based on their same organization, they're just writing a script for a play instead of creating the book. They can type their story on the computer. And then even if your computer lab has one iPad, you can request to borrow it. Hopefully you have one or more in your classroom. So they can take pictures on the iPads and put it into Google Docs or Google Slides to type their story, make an electronic version of a book. They can make a movie using iMovie, and I'll give you more directions in the next slide. And then finally, the last picture is of a girl making a stop motion animation. Actually, for my son that I mentioned, the story that he's writing, he is now doing a stop motion video. He's kind of all over the place with it, but the idea is that you pretty much just take lots of pictures and then it just looks like the characters are moving. And this is just using an app called Stop Motion. So he's only done some of the pictures so far, but then once you have some pictures in it, allows you to go back in and record your voice over it. So there's reading their story and recording it into the movie. So they still had to write all the words out, but their product is just something different. Instead of a book, it's a stop motion animation. Also, whenever you think about more publishing options, it's so exciting to think about how to get them to share their work outside of your classroom walls. So I promise you, if you ask, the grade level below you, if you can come and do some student visits and let them read to, like my first graders would go and read to the kindergartners. And they loved that because, some of the kindergartens would ask them like, how did you know how to do that? And is first grade hard? So the first graders felt like they were the big stuff going to the kindergarten classroom. But other things too, writer's night for families. There's always local and national competitions. Like I think right now there's one called Rites of Spring happening. And 2 of my first graders actually got to go and share their poems at a little coffee shop in Grand Coteau in the Rites of Spring, like on a microphone, it was just really cool. So yeah, we want to think about how to expand outside of just making books because you never know, just like the kid who was, designing the Captain Underpants novels, you might have somebody who really gets turned on to stop motion animation, maybe using iMovie, and then that could really start to nurture and develop a talent. Okay, so here's all of those examples, but just spelled out a little bit more, just telling them what to do and what they would need for each of those publishing options. But I just wanted to stop here and ask you, how do you see this as supportive of the Maker-Centered Learning model? What crossovers do you see? Yeah, so making a book, exactly. They're making something, they're able to see their product. And yeah, great point. Explain everything and having that digital story. I need to play some more with Explain Everything. I just put it on my phone. Yes, and there are definitely some modifications for pre-K. I have specific videos that are helpful with that. I mean, basically, you want them to be turned on to the act of writing is what you want. And so some teachers have actually pre-created these books. And so whenever the kids are writing, they just encourage inventive spelling, drawing pictures. So even if the spelling makes no sense, what they're getting excited about is creating stories. And even if they're able to, tell the story aloud and got some writing in there, that's a start to that whole idea of making this an exciting and engaging, purposeful activity rather than a more worksheet driven thing. Yeah, definitely, Sydney. Making is not only reserved for the tech fields, and that's really, if you start to think about it in these other ways, I think you'll find some other examples of how it can be incorporated into other things. In your reading, if you're doing literature circles, maybe you're having kids write recommendations for each other and hang them up on the wall, or give a presentation on why the class should read their stories. They're, as long as they're kind of creating, coming up with something, they're engaged in some of those elements that we love and know really work about maker-centered learning. Yeah, and all the publishing pieces are making. Great. Okay, so just to kind of start to wrap us up, which of these 6 language arts are kids practicing when they're engaged in Writer's Workshop? Would you agree that all of them? Yes. Kaylin, do y'all agree? Yes, Madeline, all of them. So whereas before in our more worksheet style, we may only kind of live in those reading and writings, but now you can fully see how all of those are swirling together, and they're not done really even in sequence, but they're just sort of all interconnected throughout the whole process. Okay, so we'll end with just some resources. So I did link out all of these. I'll share this presentation with you, but each of these little ovals has a link to it. The second one is the one that I sent you in the chat. But this is like a how-to kind of starting guide to launching Writer's Workshop, setting up those routines and things, and then some ideas for possible mini lessons to use. So you may have already had a chance to look into this document, but before we'll do questions, I just want to go through it. So this is something that you could potentially print for kids, but really it's just here to remind you of these steps so they can draw a circle and write once there was a in their journals as a brainstorming spot. I actually really like to use their journals because whenever you have parent-teacher conferences, it's just super helpful to go to pull their journals out, especially if they are writing the date sometimes in there, because you can show, look at what they were writing in August and look where they are now in November when you're having the conference. So the journals, not only this kind of journal, but a math journal too, is so helpful in those parent conferences. So they could do that right in there. So just some suggestions on how to get them started with brainstorming. Here's that organizer for you. Again, this just can be a piece of construction paper or paper folded. You can do a little like fraction lesson, divide it into 6, or you could print it out this way. So either way works. And then down here is that revising and editing checklist. So with this link, you should be able to say like file, make a copy, and put this into your own Drive account, and then you can adjust any of it however you want. And then here is something, these are suggestions on how to keep track of your student-teacher conferences. So like, you might write, the student name is Claire, we're in the first 9 weeks, and so however many lines on here might give you an idea of a goal for how many times you want to meet with Claire. So then when you do that, you just write down, the date. You're going to give Claire 1 glow, so that means something that's really strong about her writing, and then 1 area that she can grow, as well as what I would recommend as a co-constructed goal for the next conference. So you're not going to say, Claire, this is your goal for the next conference. Make sure you do it or you get a 0. You're going to ask her, what do you think your goal is going to be for your next conference? I agree with you, or maybe we can add this, and then you come up with that part together. And then there's those publishing types, and then just a blank page if you can't find those line papers. Okay, so I think that brings me to the end. I will stop share, and then if you have any questions, I'm happy to help.
That was totally awesome. Thank you so much. I see a couple of the connections. I realize, with the maker-centered learning, a lot of it's prototyping, iterating. It is a workshop. A makerspace is a workshop. So that's another great connection. And I know if we were still face-to-face, we'd be actually building scenes with Lego or Play-Doh and doing stop motion in movies. So the whole act of making scenes as part of a story development process definitely is another connection with making.
Yeah, actually, I don't know if it was last semester or one before, but the students actually made the books on the large pieces of paper with the illustrations on top. And I did that so that they could have an example whenever they go to do this with their own classrooms. But they also use the illustrations at the top to create an iMovie. So, you might have kids who created the book, but then they want to turn that same book into a movie. And so then they just zoomed in on those same illustrations to create their movie. So in that case, they were publishing in 2 different ways.
Awesome. Another question I had was just about the thinking routines that we taught with maker-centered learning, if there's a place that those would insert into this workshop process.
Yeah, I was thinking about that yesterday, thinking about the parts, purposes, complexities. I think to me, if you pick up on some of those favorite authors and you just keep going back, like I mentioned, Robert Munsch was one that we just kept going back to. If we started to pick it apart, and say like, what are the parts of this that we really like? And then what are the purposes? So like, why do you think he uses humor? Or why is there repetition in the story? I think that's one way to connect to the parts and purposes. And even in the standards, the complexities, it makes me think there's a standard about how do the illustrations contribute to the story. So the illustration isn't just there as something random, but like we're actually looking at it and viewing it, which is a language art, to understand it. And so the complexities of how illustrations and text work together could be something interesting to explore.
Yeah, on those same lines, another option, we teach those different shot types for doing movie making.
Mm-hmm.
that clearly connects with, these different, it's a system for communicating visually that movie directors use. So teaching them that system, how those parts work together, with the establishing shot, the close-ups and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, that's another, you could view it as a system using different visual systems, or like you said with the book, the illustration along with the text is a system for communicating that story. So what are the parts and their purposes, so forth.
Yeah, definitely. Anything else?
All right, any other questions?
Do you see this as useful? Do you think, I mean, can anybody see like any crossover with other subjects? Oh, Madeline said, I can see this working in so many different subjects.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
know there's also the math workshop model. I could see it working in every area, but even in science, I could see using the same framework for science.
Right, and that's really, I think, the way that we have to start thinking. The countries that are outperforming us all over the world are starting to look at learning as a more like integrated, holistic kind of experience. So, like Finland is looking at phenomenon learning. How do we look at a phenomena like weather, and then build in language arts and science and math all under this umbrella of a phenomenon. And so if we look at it that way, then I think this writing workshop model really, no matter the topic, you can use this approach to still create a product, for anything. With one of the videos that you watched before, it talked about praising the process, which goes back to that growth mindset piece. So that's something just to remember as teachers, that whenever you are conferencing with kids, that you want to make sure that what you're praising is the process. So you don't want to say, you can say things like great job, but you also want to add in, I like the way that you use some details to tell about this character. I can tell this character has a spine, if that's what you were talking about earlier in the week. So really just doing things that connect back to the overall picture of what you want them to be able to do at the end as far as process. Oh yeah, so Aaron, using iMovie for math, that's actually something we did. So I had groups of 4 kids just pick an index card that had either a plus, minus, multiplication, or division sign on it, and then their job was to create a movie to describe that operation. And so then they created movies. We used Windows Movie Maker because I had PCs in my classroom, so just on a regular desktop computer, Windows Movie Maker. And then we invited the principal to come in on movie day. We popped popcorn and she came and watched the movies about math operations. So yeah, good idea.
Yeah, and if you do have iPads, Explain Everything is also very doable for very young kids from kindergarten on up, especially if you have the pen. But even with the finger, they could do a great job with creating explainer type movies on different concepts such as math and science. Yeah,
and Cassie and Sydney both pointed out some science topics, looking at the life cycle of a caterpillar, picking an animal to write a story about. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, even if you are under scripted curriculum type of guidelines, or, you have to adhere to a certain curriculum. As long as you're following this, meeting the standards that are in that lesson and you're on the same topic, this might be a nice vehicle for you to also offer some choice in what kids are doing, while still, meeting the restrictions of the mandated curriculum.
All right. So any other final questions before we break for today? Wow, let's give a hand to Dr. Barber. What a great job. Thank you so much. If I can give thumbs up. Yeah.
Thanks. And I'll send those links to Dr. Williams to share with everyone for the presentation and for that Google Doc.
Excellent. And some students were asking, I do have a recording. Once it's processed, we'll post it up in the original document, but I'll send it to Dr. Barber so she can put it in Moodle for her students, and I'll put it in my Moodle as well. So thank you so much. This was amazing. We really
All right. Thank y'all. All right. Bye, everybody.
Hi, everybody. Thank you.